Okay, so up to now we have sort of been dealing with evil as a general problem. Last week we talked about different perspectives on evil that different groups had. We talked about the perspective of the Hindus and the Buddhists, which is very close. We talked about the perspective, as you will remember, they have this law of karma, and that if you live a life that is filled with wrongdoing, you will be reborn back into this world, and you will suffer the consequences. So evil is something that happens to a person because they did evil, and they're just desserts for it. So we talked about, in the previous one, I talked a little bit more about a group of people who call themselves, well, I don't know if they use the word, but in academic circles, we call it scientism, because their belief is that the world that is open to our five senses, the material world that we can see, hear, touch, smell, what am I missing? And hear. Taste, yeah. That is the only world that there is. There is no such thing as a spiritual world. They have come to that conclusion because, as far as they're concerned, there's no evidence of such a thing. And the reason there's no evidence of such a thing is not because there isn't evidence of such a thing, because I think there is abundant evidence of such a thing. But it's not evidence as they understand evidence. Evidence as they understand evidence is what is collected through the scientific method. And what is collected through the scientific method requires a form of study whereby the thing you are studying is right there in front of you. Although, you know, it's interesting to me, Dave, you see the launching of this new astronomical, what's it called? What do you call those things that see out into space? Telescope. Did you see that? Yeah. That thing can see. You see, the theory is, if you can, well, you can, okay? We already have the instruments. And you look at the stars in the galaxies right now, the instruments will show red, which means that they're moving away from us. Okay, so that suggests that at some point in time, you know, it was all together, and there was what they call a Big Bang, and it expanded, the universe expanded. And gravity is what forms stars. What makes stars shine is that the gravity becomes so strong that a nuclear reaction forms inside the star, and that produces energy, and so the star shines. And of course, stars also have gravity, so what's left over is formed eventually into planets. The planets revolve around the stars, and we've got millions and billions of galaxies and stars and all of this. The theory is, okay, and it was confirmed, interestingly enough, by a bunch of engineers who worked for Bell Labs. And they pointed out that if there was a Big Bang, there should be, how did they put it? There should be radiation from the Big Bang still present in the universe today. Okay? And they set out to detect it, and sure enough, they did. They detected this background radiation, they call it. And so what this telescope can do is it can look back. Of course, you understand that when we see a star, we're seeing it as it existed millions of years ago, because they're millions of light years away. So we're not seeing them as they are now. We're seeing them as they were, depending on how far away they are, millions of years ago. So the hope is that this telescope can see as far back into the universe that they can see what happened right after the Big Bang, because they can see the outer edges of the universe. It'll be interesting to see what their findings are. The interesting thing about this is that astronomers, I know I'm getting off topic here, but astronomers always thought Aristotle was correct, that the universe was eternal, that it always was, there never was a time when it wasn't, and it always would be. And what they found out, in fact, is that the universe had a beginning, which is, of course, the biblical view of how the universe came into being. It had a beginning. Okay, so scientism is the belief that nothing beyond which you can study aside from the scientific method exists. Okay, so for an advocate of scientism, there's no such thing as good or evil. There's no such thing as meaning in your life, because in point of fact, our existence is simply the result of natural processes that happened over billions of years. We evolved into what we are. We live for a period of time and then we die. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return, and you shall never return out of your dust again. That will be the end of it. So for them, there is no good or evil. They don't believe in it. Okay? So that's their point of view. We talked about postmodernism, which says that everybody has a point of view in telling stories about who they are and what their history is as a people. But we all have our own biases. We tell our story according to the way in which we understand it, and we understand it in a way in which that makes us the good guys and our enemies the bad guys. And but if you were to tell the story from the point of view of another group, for example, you would get a completely different story. So If you take, for example, American history, some years ago, a book came out by a guy named Howard Zinn. Have you ever heard of Howard Zinn? Okay. Howard Zinn wrote a book called The People's History of the United States. And he wrote it from the point of view of black slaves and Native Americans and other people who did not succeed in American prosperity. Okay? So as you can imagine, he tells a very different story of American history than the one we're used to hearing. You know, we're used to hearing about how American history is really the story of how all of these immigrants came from all over the world and came to this country. And so in any case, people came to this country and believed in the idea of freedom guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and the freedom to pursue your dreams, the pursuit of happiness, as Thomas Jefferson wrote. The point I'm trying to make here is that evil is not a theoretical problem. And remember, we divided evil up into natural and moral evil. Natural evil is evil that is the result of natural forces that come together and destroy whole towns, whole villages, upend lives. In 2005, destroyed the city of New Orleans. I mean, natural evil can indeed cause all kinds of havoc. Okay? So there's natural evil, but then there's moral evil. Moral evil is what human beings do to each other. Okay? And, that includes everything from making war on another country to the Holocaust, which is obviously perhaps the worst form of moral evil that ever took place. And slavery, there's so many examples of moral evil, we could go on and on and on and on and on. Okay, so the question is, what's going on? Now, human beings, being the people that we are, we're curious. We like to understand things. We want to know what's going on. And because we believe that if we can understand something, and remember, we talked about the 19th century where Western society was making progress, right? There were all kinds of scientific breakthroughs, especially toward the end of the 19th century. We had vaccines for polio, we had vaccines for, smallpox and other things. Surgery was getting more and more sophisticated. They still didn't know how to deal with cancer because my mother was only 13 years old when her mother got colon cancer, and they didn't know what to do with it. So she just died. Today, she probably would have lived because they just would have resected her colon and taken it out. But back then, they didn't know how to do that. Okay, so we were making all this progress, and on top of that, democracy was spreading. Everybody believed that democracy, well, they agreed basically with what Winston Churchill said, but they were a little more optimistic about it. Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government there is except for all the others. So, he was saying that, yeah, democracy is better than all the others, but still, it's not perfect, right? And of course, he got voted out after saying that. So all this progress was being made, and people were believing that that the Western world was advancing to the point where eventually we would get to a place where we could virtually do away with all kinds of different forms of evil. We could create societies where there was no poverty. We could create societies where most diseases could be cured. We could create societies where things would go much better than they had in the past, when people didn't have the knowledge that they had in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And then the world wars happened, World War I and II, and that basically destroyed any belief in human progress. That was the end of that. People despaired that human beings have the capacity to make themselves any better, that we are born flawed, broken, that there is something deep inside of us that is wrong, and we can't fix it. Okay? Now, there were secular ideologies that claimed they could fix it. Marxism was one, because it believed that what was really wrong was not something inside the human heart. What was really wrong was that capitalism was the oppression of the working class. And once the working class took possession of the means of wealth, things would improve and get better, and everything would be hunky-dory. He even used Christian imagery. He said that the new man would emerge out of this communist revolution. That comes from Paul, who calls human beings a new creation in Christ. So, but most people recognized that, especially, when the Soviet Union turned out to be exactly what it was, recognized that Marxism was not the answer either. In fact, the French philosophers who first articulated postmodern philosophy did so after the Hungarian Revolution that took place in the late 1950s. Anybody remember those? The students revolted. They wanted sovereignty for Hungary. They wanted to get out from under the rule of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union rolled in the tanks, and that was the end of that. In fact, it almost happened in China not that long ago. Remember Tiananmen Square? Yeah, it came very close. Very close. Unfortunately, the so-called Arab Spring, the Arab population from North Africa through the Middle East hoped that they could initiate a revolution that would return power to the people and get rid of these dictators. They hoped that somehow this revolution would result in, a better future for the Arab peoples of the world. But that didn't work out either. What happened in Egypt is they just ended up with another dictator. Instead of Mubarak, it became Sisi, who was another general. I'm not sure what's going on in Syria these days because you never hear about it. Anybody ever hear about Syria? I don't even know what's going on. I don't know if they've quashed the revolution over there or what's happening. And the only country during the Arab Spring that actually made progress was the country of Tunisia. The country of Tunisia became a more vibrant, democratic country. And the people there are satisfied with what went on. Okay. All right, so given the fact that most people came to the conclusion that the problem is not systems. The problem is not the political system you have, okay? Like Winston Churchill, they believed that maybe democracy is the best way to go. But democracy doesn't do away with evil, okay? Because that isn't where the seat of the evil is. The seat of evil is in the human heart, okay? That's where it is. And it runs through each and every one of us. There is something about human beings that is broken and that needs healing. And it is not something that we can heal on our own. Okay? It's something that we require outside help in order to fix the world as it is. Okay? So, now the Bible, what's interesting is that people began to see in the Bible things they didn't see before. Here's a book that's saying the same thing that we are discovering about ourselves right now. But here's the thing. The Bible does not answer the question, what is evil? It never answers that question. It never answers the question, where did evil come from? It doesn't answer that question either. Remember in the Garden of Eden, the snake just appears. It doesn't tell you where it came from. It's just there. And then when you get to the second story, the story of Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. It becomes clear at that point that the problem lies in the heart of the person who's committing the evil. Okay? So people began to see in the Bible a possible perspective on the problem of evil that wasn't present anywhere else. I mean, we had tried science, it didn't work. Okay, science can do a lot of things. Science can help us cure all kinds of diseases. I'm glad we have science because I have this aortic aneurysm, which a doctor at Stanford does a scan on once a year. And as long as it isn't getting any bigger, he says you don't have anything to worry about. And so far it hasn't gotten any bigger. He says as long as your blood pressure is normal, you should be fine. So, but should it get bigger, he can fix it. That's how good a surgeon he is. He knows how to do it. Okay? So just because I have this condition doesn't mean that I'm going to die from it. It means that I'll have to go through all kinds of yuck, but I'll survive. And so science can do a lot of things. But what science can't do is answer the question, where does evil come from? Science cannot answer why the Nazis did what they did. Science cannot answer why Stalin threw all those people in his gulags. Science cannot answer why in early America we enslaved African peoples. Science cannot answer, all kinds of these questions that have to do with evil. All right? So if the answer lies not in studying the way human beings function, in other words, with psychology, although I will once again, I've mentioned this book before, The Road Less Traveled, I think, is the best book written by a psychotherapist who tries to deal with the problem of what it looks like to live a healthy life. And he uses case histories to tell his stories. So it's a very interesting book. And then he follows it up with People of the Lie, where he deals with the issue of evil. I think those are the best two books written in the field of psychology about this subject. From a biblical point of view, like I say, number one, the Bible doesn't answer where evil comes from. It doesn't answer what it is. What the Bible does do is tell stories. Okay? It starts out with the first 11 chapters of Genesis called prehistory. We talked about those. That sets the stage for the story of salvation. Every book has a theme. The theme of the Bible is the story of salvation. It is the story of how God intervenes at certain essential places in the history of Israel to see to it that things go the way God's purposes will be served. Okay? So let me give you an example. Let's take the story of Joseph, because you all are very familiar with that. The story of Joseph is a story of a young man. He starts out kind of a narcissist. He thinks he's better than his brothers. But he pays a price that is far worse than what it deserves. First, he's sold into slavery. Then he ends up a slave in Egypt. His mistress accuses him of rape. The husband believes her, has him thrown into prison. He ends up in prison. Okay, so here's a young man who starts out the favorite of his fathers, okay, Jacob's absolute favorite son, and he ends up in prison, possibly under sentence of death. Right? And as it so happens, the Pharaoh has a dream, and Joseph knows how to interpret the dream. So he interprets the dream for Pharaoh. The Pharaoh's impressed. He puts Joseph in charge of the harvest, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought. He puts away enough for the 7 years of plenty to feed people during the 7 years of drought, and everything turns out just fine. But the bottom line of the story is that it ends with Joseph's brothers ending up back down in Egypt, and what happens? They are reconciled. Okay? And then Joseph makes a statement that is one of the ways in which God deals with evil. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Okay? So God used the evil you committed in order to see to it that I could be put in a position to save thousands of people from starvation. All right? So the point is that in the Bible, what we have is stories about how God deals with evil. We don't have stories defining evil or telling us what it is, but we have stories about how God deals with it. Okay? And about how his ultimate purpose, as the story unfolds over time. All right? Now, there is one exception to this. Not that these books actually define what evil is or what causes it, where it came from. But the section of the Old Testament which is called wisdom literature, the books of Job and Proverbs and Song of Songs, there's another one. Those books are books of wisdom. They're books of insight. Okay? And we're going to talk about the book of Job next week, because I'm going to try to get through all the main stories of the Old Testament next week. We're going to go through all of them. All right? But I wanted to make sure the stage was set for you to understand that the Bible does not define it. It tells stories about it. And in those stories, it helps us better understand how God deals with evil in our lives as well. Okay? So that when there comes times in our lives where we have to deal with suffering and grief and perhaps some form of evil of some kind, that we not let it destroy us, that we not let it drag us down, that we in fact discover through our relationship with God that God is actually going to use that experience of confronting evil, either in ourselves, either when we discover something about ourselves that we don't like, that we'd like to change, or in someone else or out in the world that we don't like and would like to change. If we have the power to do so. What these stories do is enable us to see, to gain insight as to how God is active in our lives, giving us the wherewithal to be able to deal with difficult times. Okay? I get into more detail in the essay on the issue of how the Bible understands human nature, that we are both animals and spiritual beings at the same time. You can't say that we act on instinct. If you were to say that, you would be saying essentially that we are nothing different than, suppose you were a lion, okay, and you were out on the Serengeti, and you were hungry. Now, you're a female lion. Female lions do all the hunting. Males lay under the tree and yawn. Okay? The female lion kills the zebra. Then after the zebra's dead, the male lion wanders over, and the females all get lost. And he gets to eat his portion first. And then the females come back. Okay? Now they don't make that choice. It's instinct. It's inborn in them. We're not making a moral choice. But us, we make moral choices. We have the ability to choose between one option and another, or between various options. And that's where becoming a human is both our, shall we say, our glory in a sense, and at the same time our curse. Because it is our glory in the sense that we are not inbred to just do what we're programmed to do. We have the ability to choose. But what that means is that sometimes we have to choose to do things that are difficult. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.